I love this landscape. All around me is the results of millions of years of movements of the Earth's crust. Volcanoes and colliding continents. These are the forces that shaped Britain. But there's another force that has had perhaps the greatest effect on the landscape we see around us today: ice. During the last ice age, most of Britain would have been covered with a great sheet of ice, up to a mile thick. To find out how that would have affected the landscape, I'm going to be journeying from north to south, following the path of the unstoppable ice as it ground and bulldozed its way across the country. "20,000 years ago, Britain was in the grip of an ice age. Huge glaciers and ice sheets up to a mile thick covered the land. All this ice had a dramatic effect on the landscape we see around us today. From the Highlands of Scotland to the south of England, nowhere was left unaffected by Britain's ice age. And the best place to see the immense power of all that ice is here. A vast body of water that runs through the Highlands for over 22 miles. This is Loch Ness, famous of course for the eerie monster that's supposed to lurk in its depths. But there's something at the bottom of this lake that the geologists get much more excited about. And the man who knows perhaps more than anyone what's going on deep beneath the loch's surface is Adrian Shine. Adrian first came to Loch Ness in 1973 to hunt for the Loch Ness Monster. He wanted to discover if there was any logical explanation for the hundreds of reported sightings attributed to the mythical beast. So he searched the depths in his homemade sub. He even scanned the entire loch using a fleet of boats equipped with the latest sonar equipment. But to date, he's found nothing. No surprises there. So in recent years, he's started researching what I think's a far greater mystery: how Loch Ness became so impossibly deep. The first thing that you notice as you're driving towards the loch is how incredibly big it is.
It is. It's 22 3/4 miles long, but it's the volume that's the important thing. It's got more water in it than the whole of England and Wales put together.
You've seen a monster in it?
I've seen things that have interested me. Sometimes I've been able to explain them, sometimes not. But the depth is the thing.
Which is what you've been working on?
Absolutely. And I'll show you now on our Echo Sounder.
Adrian's monster-seeking hardware is now being used to plumb the incredible depths of the loch.
This is our Echo Sounder. It's a bit like a radar, but uses sound underwater. We're sending a ping down and we're getting a pong back. And we're registering at 57 feet at the moment, and look how close to the shore we are.
It's extraordinary. So the lake does get deep very quickly, doesn't it?
Very quickly indeed. We're going to go across the loch, away from the shoreline, and we're going to follow that steep slope all the way down to the bottom. You see how regular the slope is?
Oh, yeah.
And it's just falling away.
So what we're seeing here is the shape of the sides of the loch as it's moving towards the bottom, yes?
Yes. We're just reaching the bottom now, and you see that dead straight line entering at the bottom of the trace there?
Yeah.
That is the flat silt bed.
The ping-pong sonar reveals the loch's secret: an incredibly steep U-shaped valley. And that the loch is over 750 feet deep. That's more than twice the depth of England's deepest lake, Wastwater. But what's truly remarkable is that the floor of the loch is 700 feet below sea level. Water on its own couldn't have cut this valley so far below the level of the sea. It must have been a greater force. To find out, Adrian and his team drilled into the lake bed to take core samples. The brown gunk in these cores is layer after layer of sediment that's settled at the bottom of the loch for the past 10,000 years. But it's the layer immediately underneath the muddy sediments that's the key. Where's the bottom of the lake?
Bottom of the lake is about here, and then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 metres of this very organic dark brown.
Travelling back in time.
Travelling back in time, layer by layer. And then you've got this sudden interface, this sterile blue-grey glacial clay, which is evidence of the glacier that took away the rock.
So that's the secret. Loch Ness was once filled by an enormous, powerful glacier. The top layers of mud were turned brown by rotting plants and animals, but during the last ice age, this was a barren, lifeless place. What the glacier left behind was a thick, lifeless layer of blue-grey clay made of ground-up rock. So we know that it was a glacier that actually gouged out this valley and made it the shape
Yes,
it
we do,
is.
and the division was so abrupt, you could almost say that's the morning the Ice Age ended.
So Loch Ness was filled with a giant glacier, a vast flowing river of ice that carved out this immense loch. With the end of the Ice Age, the glacier gradually melted and the loch filled with water. So if ever there was a monster in that loch, it was a monstrous great glacier. And given how deep the loch is, I'd assumed that the glacier would have to have been about 750 feet high. But I was wrong. It was actually much, much higher. Adrian's about to show me clues that reveal just how high this glacier reached. Even though it's over 10,000 years since the last glacier melted here, it's still possible to see the evidence it left behind. How high are we?
1,200 feet.
I think I felt every one of those
You
feet.
probably did. Why don't you take a rest against that rock?
Why against the rock?
It's a rocking stone. It's
You're kidding.
the stone of the rocking. If you're a MacDonald, by the way, you should avoid it, because it's meant to fall on you. Go on, give it a push.
I don't think I'm a McDonald. This really rocks?
It really does.
Oh,
There you
hey!
A few tons there.
How long's this been up here like this?
Probably about 10,000 years. Well, since the ice melted anyway, because the ice had to have put it here. I'm afraid it's not fallen out of the sky, has it?
No.
There's nowhere high enough for it to have rolled down from, and so that is clear evidence of the ice leaving it here.
So why does it move?
Well, it's because the ice has let it down ever so gently, exactly on its balance point, on its fulcrum.
Heavy rock. Now, looking at this view, you can really see that Loch Ness isn't just a lake. It actually was once this huge, long valley that was carved out by a massive glacier.
If you imagine that lake full of ice all the way up to here and probably 2,000 feet above us, gives you something to think about.
Yeah. This entire valley was filled by a truly massive glacier. At its peak, it would have been over a mile thick. A weight equivalent to more than 10 double-decker buses would have pushed down on every square foot of the valley floor. It's this grinding power that dug the loch to such incredible depths. And the fact that it's below sea level would have been no problem for the ice, because ice, unlike water, can flow uphill, pushed forward by the bulk of the glacier behind it. The immense power of ice has left its mark not just at Loch Ness, but all over the Highlands of Scotland, creating what I think is some of the most gorgeous scenery anywhere on the planet. This is Glencoe, site of the infamous Glencoe massacre, where members of the MacDonald clan were slaughtered in their beds by forces loyal to the English king. But it's also got this fantastic U-shaped valley. If you drained Loch Ness, it would probably look just like that. You see how a great lumbering glacier would have moved through it, grinding down the base, giving it this flat bottom and these very, very steep sides. But this is just one of hundreds of glens and valleys across the whole of Britain that have been forged by mile after mile of glaciers and ice sheets. To get to grips with just how much ice we're talking about, I'm taking to the skies. That down there is Loch Lomond, and you can really see the power of the ice, how it ground out this whole lake. During the Ice Age, there would have been ice all the way from the bottom of the loch to the top of the mountain. That's over a mile. You can see there how the ice has scooped out the side of the top of Ben Lomond. It's extraordinary to think that the ice got up this high, so high that it was covering a whole mountain. It's clear from up here that nowhere was left unaffected by the ice that blanketed the nation. But what caused such a massive change in the climate to make it this cold? Where did all the ice come from? Ice has carved out the rugged landscape of the Highlands of Scotland. And by all accounts, there was lots of it. A blanket of ice up to a mile thick that covered the whole of northern Britain. Now that's what I call a change in the weather. Today, climate change is headline news. But the truth is, we've known for hundreds of years that the climate's constantly changing, and sometimes it gets very, very cold. And the amazing story of how we first realised we'd once been in the grip of an endless, ferocious winter started with a mystery, right here in the heart of the Scottish Highlands. The site of that mystery is the remote valley of Glen Roy. Running around the edge of the glen, there are three strange parallel lines. For almost 200 years, scientists have been trying to unlock the secrets held in these strange markings. Local geologist Christina Bell continues to study these lines that are known locally as the parallel roads. Christina, these are called roads, and they look like roads, but they're not actually roads, are they?
No, they're not roads at all. It's a very misleading name for them.
What did people think they were in the old days?
Oh, there's various myths and legends about what these actual features are on the hillside. Some people attributed them to fairies, usually quite magical things.
But in 1840, Swiss scientist Louis Agassiz came to Glen Roy in search of a more logical explanation. He'd studied glaciers in Switzerland and believed he could spot the same features right here in Scotland.
He was like, no, these are not marine. This has been formed by a glacier sitting right here and damming a lake.
Right here where we are now?
Yeah.
So you'd have had a big glacier here and then all that would have been lake?
Yeah, and these are lake shorelines.
It was a glacier that dammed the valley, causing a lake to form. As the climate cooled, the glacier grew, changing the depth of the lake, creating the three distinct shorelines that can still be seen today. The only way the parallel roads could have been made was if the valley was dammed by a glacier. They're the proof that Louis Agassiz needed to establish the British Ice Age. So it was here at Glen Roy that scientists got this crucial piece of information to tell us that the Earth's climate isn't always the same, that Britain had once been in the grip of a terrible ice age, that it had been covered in glaciers and ice sheets. Agassiz came up with his ideas about the ice ages over 150 years ago. And the arguments about what caused such a radical change in the climate have raged ever since. The most widely accepted theory comes, perhaps unexpectedly, from the world of astronomy. Ice ages seem to coincide with very subtle changes in the orbit of the Earth around the Sun. Every 100,000 years, the Earth's orbit becomes slightly elongated, making summers shorter and cooler. Winter snow fails to melt. An ice age begins. This cycle of warm and cold has been repeated at least 15 times over the past 2 million years. Every time the climate cooled, Britain was turned into an icy wilderness. As the last ice age took hold, temperatures dropped and the ice grew, flowing down from the mountains in great sheets that marched across the lower-lying land to the south. And I'm following the course of that ice to Scotland's biggest city. Glasgow is built on land which bore the full brunt of an ice sheet that was over a mile thick. As a result, there's something quite strange happening here. Glasgow is one of my favourite cities in the whole of the UK. It's got this really buzzy nightlife, really good art scene, and of course, it's only just down the road from some of the most fabulous scenery in the whole of the world. But I bet there's one thing you didn't know about Glasgow. The whole city is rising at the rate of around about 2 millimetres a year. There was so much ice on top of Scotland and northern England during the Ice Age that its weight pushed the Earth's crust down. And then when the ice started melting, the crust began to bounce back again. And it's still bouncing back. In fact, since the end of the last Ice Age 10,000 years ago, parts of Scotland have risen by more than 100 feet. But the great mass of ice that flowed over this place had another more visible effect. It's why at times this great city looks more like San Francisco than Glasgow. Although you probably don't give it a second thought, the effects of the Ice Age are everywhere. As anyone who lives around here will tell you if they ride a bike, this city is far from flat, and that's because of the ice. To find out how ice created these steep hills, I've come to the city's ancient university. Apparently all the answers are to be found behind door 657A. Oh, this is it, 657A. Look at this. 225 steps to top. Great. So after cycling up the steepest hill in Glasgow and climbing 225 steps, I'm really hoping that glaciologist Chris Clark can explain where all these hills have come from.
These hills you've been looking at, they're called drumlins. And let's have a look at one. There's one over here, look. See this hill?
Oh, the rather swanky Victorian things here.
Yeah, that's it, those posh ones on top of the hill. And then the green flanks coming down. That's not just any ordinary hill, it's a special hill, it's a drumlin.
And was that made by glaciation?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. The ice flowing across here made this bump that we call a drumlin.
And the Victorians hijacked it for a bit of status. So underneath the Victorian grandeur lies a very special streamlined hill. A drumlin, created by a gigantic flow of ice that engulfed the city during the last Ice Age.
Remember, the city's built on them, making it harder for us to see them. Let's look at an idealised. Let's look at some... If we go down here...
Goodness me, look what's down here. Well, I never.
So, in this sandbox here, with the city stripped away, we can see these hills called drumlins. And what you've got to imagine, the ice, maybe a kilometre thick, was bulldozing and ploughing its way across this landscape. And you might, in a more boring world, expect it to just plane all the dirt away and just end up with a flat box. But what I think is quite miraculous is as the ice was flowing, these blister-like landforms grew and they have this neat pattern.
So why did the ice act like this? The ice sheet that passed over Glasgow was so heavy the ground started to behave like soft sand on a beach. Under the ice, great ripples started to appear. And then, quite mysteriously, these regular egg-shaped hills began to form. So where's that on the ground?
Well, let's take a look. Let's take this and try and match it to the landscape. we looked at the drumlin there with the houses on top, and we were looking at this upstream end.
Yeah.
So the ice was coming in this direction. And then, now let's...
This one here?
Yeah, there's this one here with the flagpole on, so that's...
So that's the wide direction.
Yeah, so it's looking longer, but it's because we're looking at the side like that.
Yeah. Chris tells me that Glasgow sits on some 180 drumlins that were all moulded during the last ice age.
See the far distance, that snow-covered peak?
Yeah.
That's Loch Lomond side up there.
Oh, so that's where the glacier came from?
Yeah, exactly. It came down through that gap, swept down past those tower blocks, and then swept around across the university here. And whilst it was doing it, it created all these wonderful blister-like landforms that now Glasgow's built on. Let's put the egg back.
Now, you do have some remarkably neat pigeons in Glasgow, don't you? As you may have already guessed, Chris is mildly obsessed with drumlins. He's not just been drumlin spotting in Glasgow. He's running a project to plot the position of every single drumlin in the British Isles. Have we any idea how many there are?
In Britain, it's over 65,000.
And you've mapped every one?
We've mapped them all.
This incredibly detailed map not only shows the location of Britain's drumlins, but also the directions they point. And this can be used to work out how the ice was flowing. So glaciologists can reconstruct how ice sheets grew and shrank back during different stages of the last ice age.
So we've got the physics of how ice works, and we've got climate. And if we press the button, off it goes. We have an ice sheet to begin with. It's getting colder, so the ice sheet grows, starts off in Scotland, and it expands out. Ice also develops over England and Wales, and we end up with a large ice sheet.
So your people produce a mathematical model about how an ice sheet might ebb and flow, but actually you can check that by looking at the drumlins outside to see what happened in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a nice way of putting it.
Is this any more than an interesting intellectual exercise, though?
Yes, it is, because if many people at the moment, scientists, politicians, people, are wondering what's going to happen to Antarctic ice sheets and the Greenland ice sheet in a warming world. You know, it's an important thing to make a prediction on. Remember, it raises sea level. This British-Irish ice sheet, when it melted, it raised sea level by 2.5 metres. We know that the West Antarctic ice sheet could raise sea level by twice that.
One way of assessing the future of the world's two remaining ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland is to look back at the events of Britain's last ice age. Chris's obsession with these unassuming little drumlin hills could help us all plan for a future where climate changes once again. Coming up here is really useful because everything that Chris said starts to come together. You can see Ben Lomond over there with the highlands behind it, and you can see how the glacier moved all the way down here right over to Glasgow. The ice actually created this whole landscape, and for me it's only when I start to understand this that I can really begin to connect with it, and that's something that's quite special. These enormous ice sheets kept on moving south. And there they had an even more powerful effect. In fact, if it wasn't for the ice ages, we wouldn't have the White Cliffs in Dover, and Britain would still be part of France. Ice has certainly made a dramatic impact on the landscape of Scotland, carving out deep glens, lochs and towering peaks. But across the border in England, ice made its mark too. The story of ice in England begins here, amongst the majestic peaks of the Lake District. I'm hiking with glaciologist Pete Nenow up to Blee Water, a small lake. And judging by the foul weather, we're about to enter another ice age. Bleewater sits in an amphitheatre-shaped bowl called a corrie. It's a classic glacial feature, and at 200 feet, it's incredibly deep. You could throw the whole of Nelson's Column in there and still have space to spare. It's worth the climb, isn't it?
It certainly is, yeah.
It must be one of the most beautiful landscapes in Britain. Throughout my trip, I've seen the effects of glaciers, but I'm curious to know how the glaciers themselves were created.
Glaciers form basically where snow accumulates. So where we are here, we can see up sort of Bleewater behind and the back wall of this, what's termed a corrie. Climate got cooler, you start getting more snowfall. Snow blows off the plateau and into this corrie, and as the snow builds up over time, if it doesn't melt in a summer, it builds up and gradually turns to ice. And once it's turned to ice, then it can start to flow downhill like a sort of a stiff porridge. And that's what a glacier is. It's a body of ice that flows downhill under gravity.
How does it grab the rock which it uses to gouge out the valley?
So what it does is that as it's flowing, it's sliding, it's slipping at the bottom, and that slipping process is grinding the bedrock underneath, and water at the bed of the glacier would be percolating down into the cracks and then refreezing and fractures or plucks the rock.
So glaciers not only grind away at rocks, they also split, pluck and rip out huge boulders. What happens to all the rock that it grinds away?
So what happens is as it picks up the rock and it starts flowing down valley, it transports the material down valley, and then it dumps it at some point further downstream, and then as glaciers retreat, they leave material at their sort of furthest limit, and then as they gradually work their way back up the valley, you're left with what we can see here is a series of moraines on the left-hand side here. These
little humps.
Yeah, they're basically lines of debris of the material carried by the glacier, and you can see you've actually got sequential lines, and what they represent are the retreating margin of the ice sheet.
It is extraordinary. You can actually see where the glacier was all around this landscape. By drawing a line from the moraines at the base and sides of the glacier to the corrie at the head of the valley, it's possible to work out exactly where the glacier once sat. Glaciers are like nature's bulldozers. They gouge and rip out the rock at the top of a valley, transport it all the way down to the bottom and then leave it in piles. But Britain's last ice age wasn't just formed by a few glaciers. It was formed by great ice sheets. As temperatures dropped, the glaciers grew, eventually joining up to form vast blocks of ice. These ice sheets then flowed out across the lower lying land, pushed by the great weight of ice and snow that built up in the mountains. In fact, if you're watching this anywhere from Glasgow to Birmingham, 20,000 years ago, where you're sitting now, would have been under a sheet of ice that was, in places, over a mile thick. To get an idea of the power of that ice sheet, Pete's going to show me something a bit further to the south of here. We're driving just 50 miles and crossing into Yorkshire. God's country, as the locals would have you believe. Our destination is just outside a little village called Ostwick in the Dales, and a grassy hillside strewn with strange boulders. At first glance, these rocks look like any other scatter of boulders on a hillside. But when you examine them a bit more closely, a puzzle begins to emerge. They're not actually from here at all. That has got to be one of the most extraordinary stones I've ever seen. It's like something out of Alice in Wonderland, isn't it?
Yeah, they're called glacial erratics.
Erratics?
Yeah, and what they are is they're rocks that have been brought here by a glacier.
How did it end up perched on those little bits of rock there?
Well, what's happened is the rock underneath has become eroded over the sort of last 15,000, 16,000 years. And you get left with this, what's termed a pedestal, and this is left basically standing 30, 40 centimetres above the local rock.
So, because that rock is softer than this rock, all that's eroded away?
Yeah.
But it's where these giant rocks come from that gives geologists a clue about exactly what kind of ice brought them here. Do you think this has always been a cluster of rocks, or is it more likely to have been one big rock that fractured over time?
I suspect it probably was one big rock, and it's broken up by frost action into a number of different pieces, but you'd have to really reconstruct it like a jigsaw to be certain of that. But what is really clear is, the largest bit is absolutely enormous, and there's no way that this could have been brought here by either rolling down the slope or by rivers.
But presumably where it comes from is higher than this.
No, not in this case. We know from the type of geology that this is made out of, the type of rock, that the rock came from a lower elevation, so down in the valley, and then the ice has flowed this way, and as it's flowed uphill, it's actually transported material of this size up the hill.
So it's carried this 2 miles uphill?
Well, it's carried it about 100 metres, 2 miles uphill, 100 metres vertically. So you need a lot of power to do that.
So this is so much ice that it actually ignores the topography, it just goes where it wants to?
Yeah. No, I mean, you can look at glaciers today and ice sheets today. The size of material they move is enormous. You could dump a bus on a glacier or an ice sheet and it would move it without any trouble at all. And this is a much heavier thing than a bus.
This field of rocks is evidence that a vast ice sheet once flowed across this landscape. It's one of several that have advanced and retreated across Britain over the last 2.5 million years. But which one went furthest south? And where did it stop? The peak of the last ice age was about 20,000 years ago. Ice sheets flowed from the mountains down to a line that today runs from Grimsby in the east, diagonally down through Derby and Birmingham, ending in Gloucester and Cardiff to the west. By pure coincidence, this follows the line that economists and politicians call the North-South Divide. And back then, it really was grim up north. But this ice age wasn't the worst to hit Britain. 450,000 years ago, temperatures dropped even further, creating the biggest ice sheet of them all, known as the Anglian Ice Sheet. This ice sheet would have a dramatic effect on the whole of Britain, but most especially, it played a crucial role in creating the landscape of our capital city, London. The bright lights beckon. But no, I ended up in Hornchurch, a quiet dormitory suburb 5 miles north of the Thames. And guess what? It's raining again. I thought I knew this area pretty well. I was brought up not far from here. In fact, my Aunt Ethel used to live right down that road. But I never ever imagined that thousands of years ago this leafy suburb had been covered by a vast blanket of ice. The evidence for this wintry past was found when the Romford to Upminster line was dug in 1892. The railway embankment tells an incredible story of London's past, and Danielle Shreve is getting stuck in to find the evidence for me. Danielle, this looks to me just like muddy steps up the side of a railway embankment, but you're going to tell me it's more significant than that, aren't you?
It is indeed, because what we have here is evidence for the most southerly reaching glaciation anywhere in Britain.
What's the evidence?
Can you see that line there? There's a very clear junction between this brown, grey, sticky clay below and the orange, sandy gravels of the River Thames above.
Yeah, that's really clear.
What it's telling us is that a glacier moved into this part of Britain. And in fact, if I dig out a chunk, you'll see exactly what I mean. You see these chalky pellets here?
Yeah.
There's no chalk in the local geology. So in fact, what this glacier has done is to rip up bits of chalk from the area of East Anglia. There's also small fossils in there that tell us that the glaciers moved over the area of the Wash and the Fens. And there are larger chunks of chalk as well. You can see a flattened surface where the glacier has moved this chalk along.
Whereas if it had been in a river rather than in ice, it would have tumbled and been more rounded, yeah?
That's right.
What was the effect of the glaciation around here?
Really dramatic. In fact, prior to the glacier coming into the area, the Thames ran much further to the north.
Really? So the Thames hasn't always been here? That's extraordinary, isn't it? Because we think of the Thames as being one of the most immovable things in southern England.
It's moved around a lot in the past, and in fact the most dramatic occurrence was when this glacier arrived. It caused the Thames to pond up against the ice sheet, creating these massive ice-dammed lakes.
So the Thames used to flow much further to the north, reaching the sea somewhere near Clacton in Essex. And instead of Henley-on-Thames, back then it would have been Chelmsford-on-Thames. But when the Anglian ice sheet moved south, it blocked the course of the river, forming large lakes. Eventually, the lakes burst their banks, causing the Thames to take the more southerly course we see today. But this isn't quite as far as the glacier got, is it?
No, if you go just to the top of the hill, you can see the church, and that's the point where the glacier stopped.
Right. Finally, the end of the line for ice in Britain comes into view. This spot at St Andrews in Hornchurch has been identified by geologists as the southernmost point of the ice sheet in mainland Britain. Thousands of years ago, this would have been the edge of a vast ice sheet that extended from here right the way to the North Pole. As this great ice sheet began to melt, the giant Thames lakes grew rapidly. Eventually, they started to flood. A huge torrent of water tore through a line of low chalk hills to the south, creating the white cliffs of Dover and severing our last remaining link with continental Europe. The English Channel was created, and for the first time, Britain became an island. So it was ice that changed the course of the mighty Thames, and it was the ending of that ice age that cut Britain adrift from the continent. But ancient climate change didn't just make us an island. It had another extraordinary trick up its sleeve that excavations just a few miles downriver from here are about to reveal. Britain's deep freeze had a dramatic effect on the land we see around us today. But in the past, it wasn't only really cold, it also got really hot. And some of the most dramatic evidence for ancient global warming has been found right here on our doorstep, close to the Thames in East London. Welcome to historic Purfleet, at the back end of a distribution warehouse with the Dartford crossing of the M25 in the background. But beneath this industrial wasteland lies evidence of a very different past. Paleontologist Danielle Shreve is leading me through the bushes to a snapshot in time that shows what happened to the British climate 300,000 years ago. All these different coloured layers. It's like one of those little glass lighthouses that you get at the seaside. What do they all tell us?
It's an amazing story here. We're still in the River Thames, but we're 100,000 years later than what we saw at Hornchurch.
And we're now at Purfleet.
We're now at Purfleet, and we've got a succession of deposits, almost like a sandwich of cold, then interglacial or warm climate, and then cold climate deposits at the top.
But this isn't the same time as the ice age that we were looking at up at the railway line.
No, we're a whole cycle later, so 100,000 years later.
Above the layers that were laid down during the ice age lies an orange sandy layer chock full of shells. These distinctive sediments were made by the ancient Thames, when the world was a very different place. This is extraordinary. How old is this?
This is about 300,000 years old. It's amazing, isn't it?
I don't think I've ever seen so many old shells in one place.
It's absolutely chock full of shells, and most of these are freshwater mussels. They indicate a big lowland river with water depths of about 5 metres, so a substantial body of water.
Have you found anything here apart from shells?
Yes, as you'd expect for a big river, there's lots and lots of bones of fish, but also some interesting animals that were living alongside the banks.
Yeah.
So some of the things that we've got are these little fellas here. This is a monkey's finger bone.
Oh, it's great, isn't it?
This is a macaque monkey, so the same species that we find living in Gibraltar today. These were
Really
around in
aggressive little nuisances these are, aren't they?
They were around in Britain.
Yeah.
So the other things that we've got are the fossilised spotted hyena dropping.
Oh, come on, how do you know this is spotted hyena?
Well, it's partly the shape, but also because it's full of bone, because the hyenas crunch down the bone and then this is what allows the droppings to fossilise.
If you've got monkeys and hyenas here, it must have been really hot, mustn't it?
Well, in fact, although summer temperatures were about 5 degrees warmer, it was completely normal to have these animals living here. Elephants, rhinos, horses, cattle, all of them living quite happily in Britain.
How long did this hot period last?
About 10,000 years, after which we start to see the climate deteriorating.
So as the climate cooled over thousands of years, the monkeys and hyenas scampered back to Africa and a new ice age began. But sure enough, regular as clockwork, about 100,000 years later, that ice age ended and warmer climes returned to sunny East London. The evidence for this period of balmy weather was found at an equally glamorous location: roadworks on the side of the A13. Danielle and her team were given just 2 weeks to excavate the site before the bulldozers moved in. What they discovered was truly remarkable. Some massive bones.
Super, aren't they? In fact, these are all parts of an extinct narrow-nosed rhinoceros. We've got a shoulder blade and a massive rib, so it gives you some idea of the size of the rib cage of this animal.
What's this one?
That's a really chunky bone, which is the bottom part of the upper arm. Over here, we've got remains of wild horse. Here, we've got part of a complete skeleton of an aurochs, the ancestral wild cattle. And hunting these animals, a massive predator, we have remains of lion. And this is an animal that's a third larger in size than the modern African species.
So we've seen 3 different sites here, but the story seems to be similar in each one. You get intense cold, warmth, heat, then back to cold again.
Absolutely. And in fact, in contrast to what we have at Purfleet, instead of a densely forested environment, we've now got an open savanna-like grassland.
This is London's famous Leicester Square, and right over here, this pinkish building, that's the Hippodrome Theatre, where in the early years of the 20th century they had successful shows featuring wild African beasts. But what the excited audiences in those days couldn't possibly have realised was that under their feet there were the bones of hippos and giant lions, which in the days before the last ice age used to prowl around on this very spot, no doubt looking for a takeaway. The finds made across the UK point to a regular cycle of warm spells followed by long ice ages. This 100,000-year cycle has so far been pretty regular, so scientists are already predicting when the next ice age is due. And by my calculations, as it's more than 100,000 years since the beginning of the last one, that's just about now. But instead of getting colder, the world is warming. Scientists suspect that this natural cycle of climate change is being disrupted by human activity. As a result, the long-term future of our climate lies in the balance. But if Britain's past is anything to go by, then our future climate will bring dramatic and far-reaching changes. This has been a fascinating journey for me, and on the way I've visited some of the most stunning places in Britain, and again I've seen how the ice ages played a key role in the shaping of Britain. They've carved out the dramatic peaks and glens of the Highlands, dotted the landscape with thousands of drumlin hills, and changed the course of the mighty Thames. It was the ending of an ice age that finally cut Britain off from the continent, and what was born was the Britain we know today.